Welcome back to All Things Roman Empire. Today, we're diving into a fascinating part of daily Roman life, something that shaped their entire civilization: how Romans raised their kids. We will explore what childhood looked like in ancient Rome, from family roles and discipline to schooling, and even the surprising freedoms some Roman children had. We will also uncover lesser-known facts that you probably won't hear in your high school history class. So grab a seat, because raising kids Roman style was a lot tougher, stricter, and sometimes stranger than you might think. In ancient Rome, children weren't always viewed the same way we see them today. Childhood was seen as preparation for adulthood, not a time of innocence or carefree play. One of the most powerful figures in a Roman child's life was the paterfamilias, or head of the household, usually the father. He legally had complete control over his children, even into adulthood. Technically, a father could decide whether a newborn was kept or abandoned, and even later in life, he could control marriages, careers, and property. But before we imagine every Roman father, as cruel, many families were deeply affectionate. Letters and epitaphs show Roman parents mourning children who died young, writing about their sweetness and love. Childhood mortality was high, so every year a child survived was worth celebrating. In the earliest years, Roman children stayed at home with their mother, nurse, and household slaves. Wealthier families often hired nurses who not only fed the baby, but also taught them early manners and speech. Roman authors like Quintilian even advised parents to pick nurses carefully, because children would naturally imitate their accent and vocabulary. Here's a lesser-known fact: toys were surprisingly common in Roman homes. Archaeologists have found dolls with movable limbs, miniature carts, and even toy swords. Children also played with nuts, which worked like dice or marbles. So despite the seriousness of Roman society, play was still an important part of childhood. Now, let's talk discipline. Roman parents believed children needed strict moral guidance. Obedience, respect for elders, and modesty were drilled in early. Disobedience could mean harsh punishments, sometimes physical discipline, though not all parents approved of it. Cato the Elder, a famously stern Roman statesman, recommended raising boys tough. Simple clothing, hard beds, and exposure to the elements said they grew strong. Luxury, in his view, made children weak. But here's the twist: Romans didn't just use punishment. They valued role models. Children were expected to accompany their fathers to public events, courts, and even military reviews to learn by watching. Imagine being 10 years old and standing next to your dad in the forum while legal trials took place. That was a Roman classroom too. Formal schooling usually began around age 7. Boys, and sometimes girls, went to small schools run by literators or teachers. These weren't glamorous institutions. Imagine cramped rented rooms, noisy children, and a strict teacher with a stick in hand. Students learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, often by memorizing and reciting texts out loud. Wax tablets and styluses, with their notebooks erasable and reusable, which was handy. A fun fact: wealthy Roman kids might have their homework carried by a slave called a pedagogos, who also made sure they behaved properly. By their teenage years, elite boys moved on to grammar schools where they studied literature, poetry, and rhetoric. Girls, unless they came from especially wealthy or progressive families, usually stopped formal schooling early. But many Roman women were surprisingly well-educated. Letters and poems from women survive to this day. For Roman boys, the transition from childhood to adulthood was highly symbolic and deeply tied to Roman values of duty, citizenship, and family honor. Around the age of 14 to 16, a boy would undergo the toga virilis ceremony, the moment when he laid aside his toga, pretexta, the child's toga with a purple border, and put on the plain white toga virilis. This wasn't just a wardrobe change. It marked his legal and social status as a Roman citizen, able to vote, inherit, and participate in civic life. The ceremony often included a visit to the family shrine, where he dedicated his childhood amulet, the bulla, to the household gods. Afterward, the family would often escort him through the forum, publicly presenting him as a young man ready to take on his civic duties. But coming of age wasn't only about ceremony. It was also about mentorship and practical preparation. Young men were expected to shadow their fathers or family patrons in political, legal, or military contexts. A boy from a senatorial family might begin accompanying his father to Senate sessions or public debates, learning the art of persuasion and statesmanship by observation. Military training was also considered vital. Even before serving in the legions, young aristocrats might practice horsemanship, hunting, and weapons drills to prove their physical ability and courage qualities Romans valued in leaders. For girls, the transition to adulthood was more closely tied to marriage. Girls often married between ages 12 and 16, sometimes even younger in elite circles. Though Roman law technically allowed girls to marry at 12 and boys at 14, preparation for adulthood then often meant learning how to manage a household. This included overseeing slaves, budgeting resources, weaving, and managing food supplies. In wealthier families, young women sometimes received education in literature and philosophy too, especially if their families valued intellectual pursuits. While girls didn't undergo a toga virilis ceremony, they might dedicate their childhood amulets, the lumulae, to the gods before marriage, symbolizing the transition to womanhood. What's especially interesting is that for both boys and girls, the move into adulthood was not only a family milestone, but a civic one. Romans believed that strong citizens came from strong families, and raising children to be disciplined, responsible, and prepared for public or domestic roles was seen as an investment in the survival of Rome itself. Adulthood meant duty to family, to the gods, and above all, to the state. Here are a few things you might not know about Roman children. Roman kids had their own protective amulets. Boys wore a round locket called a bulla, while girls wore a similar item called a lumula. These were believed to protect them from evil spirits until adulthood. Education wasn't always about books. Romans believed memorization and recitation were key, so kids might be punished if they didn't perfectly recall their lessons. And despite all the discipline, Roman graffiti shows that kids, just like today, sometimes doodled on walls and scratched their names in public places. Some of those scribbles are still visible 2,000 years later. So, raising children in ancient Rome was a mix of strict discipline, moral training, and surprisingly modern touches like toys, school, and even doodling. Childhood wasn't always easy, but it prepared Roman kids to take on roles as citizens of one of history's greatest empires. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Roman childhood and education, make sure to hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe to All Things Roman Empire for more daily insights into life, culture, and history of the ancient world. Thanks for watching, and remember, when in Rome, do as the Romans did.